Hi, everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce Scott Bessent, the founder, CEO, and chief investment officer of Key Square Group, a global investment firm he launched in 2015. Prior to that, Mr. Bessent served as chief investment officer at Soros Fund Management, where he held a number of roles through the 1990s and 2000s, among them overseeing investments in Europe. Outside the world of finance, he has taught economic history at Yale, his alma mater, and been a prolific philanthropist, including in his home state of South Carolina. Please join me in welcoming Scott Bessent. Scott, you've been a respected voice in financial markets for decades, but you've only recently started weighing in publicly on larger questions of U.S. public policy and the stakes of the 2024 election. What motivated you to start speaking out about the direction of American economic policy?
Yeah, well, Rian, first, thanks to you, Manhattan Institute, for having me. And when Rian invited me, he said, just so you know, we have Heather McDonald, we have Chris Rufo. I said, okay, you have made those two, so I don't need any more. But it's a good question. I've always been politically interested. For macro investing, you're always politically adjacent because geopolitics. People ask me, what is macro investing? I said, we live at the edge of geopolitics, economics, and gravity. And eventually gravity wins. For a long time, I've been analyzing political situations, economic situations, and I just decided that 2023, 2024 is important for me to come out from behind my desk because I think we are at a very unique moment here. And I would list three reasons, or three things that I'm focused on, is one, just in the US, I am alarmed by the size of these deficits and the spending. We do not have a tax collection problem, we have a spending problem. And I've never really seen anything we've never seen anything quite like this. I'm an economic historian, and for anyone wants, for better or worse, I can tell you, what the budget deficit was under Lyndon Johnson in 1967 as a percent of GDP. And this is really alarming in terms of this 6-7% deficit during peacetime, during a non-recessionary time. And I think that the Biden administration knows what they're doing. They're two very different choices for America. They have a central planning, top-down mindset going back to, it's kind of the 60s and the 70s show revisited. I was at Yale when James Tobin was there. He was Janet Yellen's the PhD advisor. And I thought we had put all this on the scrap heap of history, but it's back. And it's not working any better this time. I would argue probably worse. So I think that we were confronted with that choice, and maybe we'll get into my view of whether we want to call it Bidenomics, Bidenflation. Sometimes they call it Bidenitis, because it's almost like an acute disease. It's just always there. You don't know when it's going to flare up. When I'm in a particularly bad mood, I call it Bidenism, like Peronism, or the Bidenissimo. I think on the other side, we see from Trump 1.0, it is not a strict adherence to Reagan's principles, but it's a pretty good 21st century adaptation, and it really worked for everybody. And I'll bring that back to number three, but igniting the private sector and the kind of balanced across all income distributions and per capital and labor growth that we had, I thought was phenomenal. So that's number one. Number two, I think as an economic historian and someone who's been in markets for 40 years, I actually think I'm starting to look like it now, is I think we're also at a unique moment geopolitically, and I could see in the next few years that we are going to have some kind of a grand global economic reordering. There's something on the equivalent of a new Bretton Woods, or if you want to go back, like something back to the steel agreements or the Treaty of Versailles. There's a very good chance that we are going to have to have that over the next 4 years, and I'd like to be a part of it. I've studied this. I think it's kind of a unique skill set. And then 3, as both of your most recent panelists said, the Republican coalition is now a very new coalition. And I am very dedicated and focused to making sure that keeps expanding and to make sure that this new group who's joined the Republican Party, that the policies are good for them and that we retain those groups and continue growing, turn it into majorities. 2 weeks ago here in DC, the gentleman and I had a day with 150 or 200 black entrepreneurs, and it was fascinating. Many of them have always been Republicans, some have just switched, some are Trump curious, and to spend the day with these folks was so enlightening. They feel as though they are not getting adequate representation in the Republican Party. They're insulted by Donald Trump went to jail, so that's why black people are voting for him. These people at this event, they're entrepreneurs, they're business people, they're first generation, and they're rich. They are franchise owners, they are car dealers, and they are not Ivy League graduates who are senior vice presidents at a Fortune 500 company. This is Main Street, and I think that's the natural progression for the Republican Party. So my third reason for coming out behind my desk is to make sure that constituency gets bigger and bigger.
It's fascinating. I wonder, you've painted a pretty bleak picture of Biden's economic agenda, but I think he would say, look, my agenda has been a historic success. Labor markets are tight. The Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act are spurring investment. And while the president acknowledges that inflation has been a challenge, he'd argue that the worst is behind us. Let's drill in a bit about where you think a second Biden term will take the country economically. Because again, what the president is saying is that, this course is delivering, ultimately it's going to be delivering wage growth, it's going to help us compete with China and what have you. So when you're looking ahead to another 4 years of President Biden, where do you see the US economy at the end of that?
Yeah, well, back to what was said on one of the earlier panels is he's given away so much money. Why are the programs so unpopular? There's this movie called The Kingmaker that's about Imelda Marcos, and she's on a bus throwing out dollar bills, and she's super popular. Her son's president of the Philippines now, so money can buy you vote and love, and that's not happening this time. And I think to give my overview, when you've got this top-down view and this Turing machine where you think you can turn the dials, go kind of back to JFK's economic cabinet, the economy's too big and too complex. These are linear people with a linear program, and they have gotten a linear result. So the linear result, the global result, is unemployment is low, investment is high, and everyone is unhappy. So the output is fine, but the nonlinearity in the system means that all the components really aren't working that well. I've been quoted before as saying, look, I can make Zimbabwe great again if I had a 7% budget deficit in reserve currency. But, and I think one of the former panelists was getting at when they were talking about the Fed putting on the brakes and the Biden administration hitting the accelerator brakes. In Grand Prix racing, it's called two-footed driving. And you're hitting the gas, then you're hitting the brake, and you're going around the corner, and the engine burns out. And I think that's what's happening here. And this inflation, I think the American people aren't going to forgive him for it.
So you don't think that the inflation is transitory? You think that even though it's moderated somewhat, you think that we're on a kind of knife edge where it could come back, roaring back, if you don't see a material change in economic policy?
Look, it's always there. It would reaccelerate. We've had this very steep price level decline that I think has Americans seething, and my firm is not very good at. We don't try to predict particular numbers. We try to get the direction of travel. And we're getting employment number tomorrow, and maybe the heat has come off the jobs market, but it's come off the jobs market in a bad way through mass unfettered immigration. That should not be a tool in the toolkit for getting down inflation, because back to the question of why everyone's unhappy is, could you imagine what the bottom 25% of wage earners' wages would have been if we hadn't had, depending on the number you want to use, 10, 15, 20 million new arrivals? And if I look at these policies, there's this, what I believe is a flawed macro machine, and then they keep trying to make micro adjustments. So they cause the great inflation, housing market takes off, then mortgage rates take off, and young people or all people are now locked out of the housing market. So we're going to announce a $10,000 starter kit and then a $400 a month subsidy, and it's just all these irregularities and contortions in the system that are so unhealthy, and all they're doing is pushing the housing market up more. But the real problem in the housing market is going to come in 12, 18, or 24 months, because new arrivals typically take 24 months to start forming households. So guess what? There's going to be more competition for housing that's probably
relatively fixed supply.
Yeah, well, we're probably in a 2 or 2.5 million dwelling deficit. So it's just with this top-down view, you're just getting all of slice after slice of the problems at all the micro levels.
So more housing insecurity, maybe even more homelessness in the streets of some American cities. And then you could try to say, hey, we'll build more public housing or what have you, but of course that's not a great track record. Building on that, many Americans are itching for a return to the lower interest rates that prevailed for most of the past 20 years. Others believe ultra-low rates have overstimulated the economy and badly distorted the market for risky assets. With the Bank of Canada and the European Central Bank cutting their key policy rates just this week, what do you expect from the Fed over the coming months, and what should the Fed do? Do you think that right now, just kind of grabbing Jay Powell by the lapel and just saying, cut the key policy rate now is the right step?
Well, look, I think Bank of Canada and ECB can cut because the Canadians and the Europeans exercise some level of fiscal prudence. So they're not two-footed driving. There is a natural economic cycle, and Jay Powell has been easing. For whatever reason, he felt compelled to ease financial conditions last fall. After the FOMC meetings in November and December, the statements were very anodyne, and he walked out and in the press conference gave very dovish guidance of rate cuts are coming, and did a massive ease in financial conditions. By doing that, what happened? He pushed up the stock market, which benefits the top 20%, And then we're back to the bottom 50% who don't own assets. They have debt. So rates have had to stay higher for longer. I actually think that he's hurt Biden's chances by reigniting inflation, pushing economic growth, reaccelerating economic growth, when it could have been slowing. I think they could have been cutting rates, but they're not. And I would also predict that it won't be a slowdown in inflation that causes rates to get cut. I think it will be an economic wobble.
When you say an economic wobble, you mean that there's going to be some kind of maybe a quarter of negative growth or something like that?
Yeah, or some kind of a slowdown in the economy. I think it'll be an economic slowdown,
right,
that actually caused it. But the administration has a lot of tricks up their sleeve between now and November 5th, November 6th, November 7th. Everything's up for grabs, but we're probably going to see, 100, 150 billion come out from the COVID employee retention checks. Those checks are going to conveniently start getting mailed out next month.
Fascinating. And you've certainly seen student loan forgiveness, a variety of other administrative measures that are designed to help buoy the economy.
Well, and back to the younger voters have really started to turn on President Biden. I've seen some of the numbers, and the under 35 cohort had been very, very attached to the Democratic Party, and that's starting to move. And I think a big portion of that's housing. I think the other thing too is, if you look now, Philadelphia Fed has been measuring credit card delinquencies since 2012, and we are at the highest rate of delinquencies since they've been measuring. And that is primarily the lower 25% income group, but the other group that has very high credit card delinquencies is the 35 and under.
Fascinating.
Because they don't have assets.
There's a stark difference between the tax policies being proposed by former President Donald Trump and incumbent President Joe Biden. Let's start with Biden. Among other things, the president has called for steep tax increases on corporate income and investment income, and he insists that this will leave middle and lower income households untouched. Now, you've talked about your concerns about deficits and debt, so where do you stand on Biden's approach and the particular tax increases that he's most focused on?
Well, to come back to your initial question, why did I come out from behind my desk now? I view 2024 as the last chance to grow our way out of this problem. Four more years of layering on this amount of debt, and then we end up in a permanent style European malaise. And maybe you have to go to a higher taxation regime just to hold things in place, a la France. I do think now there is an opportunity to grow our way out of this, but I think it's this Biden layering onto the debt. I am deeply cynical about this. It's spend, spend, spend. Many of the assets maybe aren't productive. Clearly, they've gotten rid of scoring. So you're replacing things that work with things that maybe even work less well. So these could be stranded assets. And now they're going to say, well, we've done all this spending. We got to pay the piper. And I have a piece that came out yesterday, and it is part of a series that they ask about 10 or 12 people in the international economy, a magazine, how do we restart American productivity? And my number one, you do it through tax policy, and you keep high after-tax returns on capital. So raising these capital gains taxes, or raising the taxes and raising the corporate taxes, is just the wrong thing. And it is a sleight of hand when Biden says that he's not going to raise taxes on anyone making less than $400,000, because if you're going to move cap gains up to the same level as ordinary income, that's going to apply to everybody. So I think that this is just worse and worse, and this is...
And then there's the incidence of corporate taxes as well, because that presumably has an impact on wages indirectly, on consumers indirectly.
Yeah. Look, we saw an investment boom 18, 19. And the other thing too is the 2017 Trump tax cut, a lot of the deficits were front-loaded because the investment expenses were in those years. So these Biden deficits are actually worse because the expenses was 100% on day one. So I just think that this is kind of a dynamism killer. And then some of these other ideas, like taxing unrealized capital gains. You want to tax unrealized capital gains. If you want to drive the venture capital industry offshore, I couldn't have come up with a better way to do that. I'm on a foundation board, and every 3 years to make us feel not very smart, they take us out to Silicon Valley. On our last trip, we said, we don't want to meet the fund managers this time. We want to meet the entrepreneurs. What was fascinating? 6 out of the 8 entrepreneurs were not native-born Americans. So that is high-end, high-class immigration. But those people could all be in Singapore. They could all be in Israel. They could all be in Abu Dhabi, and we will drive that whole class offshore.
You noted earlier on that you saw the Trump presidency as a shrewd adaptation of the Reagan-era playbook for the 21st century. I wonder if you could elaborate on that. When you think about the ways in which he made selective departures, the ways in which he did kind of reaffirm ideas in the Reagan playbook, talk to us about the parallels.
Well, let's go back to where we were in 1980. Reagan came in with high inflation and kind of the great malaise and the Soviet Union. So Trump came in, wasn't malaise, but growth was kind of punked. The recovery post-GFC had not been strong. And they both immediately went for tax cuts. They both focused on the biggest external threat. Reagan spent the Soviet Union into oblivion. I think Trump had a different idea for how to deal with China and make up for a lot of bad trade, historical trade agreements, and kind of push things forward. And I think that once Trump was in office, and even Make America Great Again, it was a Reagan-esque saying. It's an optimistic vision of America instead of managed decline, which I would think that a Biden 2.0 would be. But I will say, and some of the other panels were asked this, I think whoever wins has a mandate. If Joe Biden wins, he has a mandate for central planning and things on the periphery and novel economic ideas or social policy dressed as economics. And Donald Trump will have a mandate for deregulation, closing the border, and energy independence, and projecting strength. So both candidates will have a mandate.
So going back to tax policy for a moment, Donald Trump is calling for making the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent, and he's also calling for a big across-the-board increase in tariffs, a policy that critics see as self-defeating. Is there a role for tariffs in a conservative economic policy agenda?
So let's go back to Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton believed in tariffs for 2 reasons. And when he was setting up the Treasury, there was no real revenue. So tariffs, up until World War I, tariffs were the main source of revenue. But he believed in tariffs for generate revenue and to protect nascent U.S. industry. I would add a 3rd reason for tariffs, and it is negotiating. So I think that given Donald Trump's credibility and what he has done in the past on tariffs, that we may not have to get to tariffs, but the threat of tariffs will change the quality and the fairness of a lot of historically poor trade deals. President Trump, Ambassador Lighthizer are very focused on the trade deficit, and they talk about that it's a function of bad trade agreements. And I think that tariffs are one way to remedy that, but I think anyone with an economics background will also tell you that the trade deficit comes from our budget deficit and from the level of the currency. So there's this interaction and the calculus between the three, and I don't think, so I believe that in a conservative agenda, tariffs do have a place, but I think that it is part of a calculus of all the tools in the toolkit.
So you are someone, you might be among the world's leading experts on currency fluctuations and how to think about them. So if you go back to the Reagan era, you had the Plaza Accords, you've had a number of different moments.
You had two, the Plaza Accord, then the Louvre Accord. So
yes.
It was up, then down.
Well, talk to us a bit about that, and talk to us about whether or not you see some kind of large-scale currency intervention as an important tool for the next presidential administration.
I don't think there has to be a large-scale currency intervention. What I think we have to have is to go back to like the 80s and even the 90s, where there's a large-scale coordination between currency, between fiscal, between monetary, and with the Chinese, with a lot of these mercantilist systems, these excess reserves that are being accumulated, the level of the excess reserves just tells you that probably there's the initial trade agreement's not right, the level of the currency is being suppressed, that there's hidden subsidies. So there's something wrong there with these excess reserves. And is there something else that could be done? Could you say, well, you're accumulating these excess reserves, you're moving out of treasuries, maybe we don't think that's a good idea.
So essentially, the strength of the dollar right now is a product of interventions that other states are undertaking, including some adversaries are undertaking, and we need to be more proactive?
Well, I think we are not thinking about it the way we used to. And I think it's back into this calculus. And the other thing too is when you're running these massive deficits that generate the high inflationary level, the biggest currency in the world is now a carry currency. There's on forward points a real pickup in yield over the Japanese yen of 3.5%. Like that's not sustainable or optimal over the long term. But I think we have to keep coming back to China because, like, how do we think about the Chinese currency? Our research at my firm shows we think the Chinese currency on any academic model is now undervalued. They've done a big internal devaluation. They've cut labor. They've written down real estate. Very, very similar to what happened to the Europeans 2011, 2012. But China's the currency is in three different equilibria. You're statistically cheap. You have 99% of your citizens, if they could take the money out, they would. And then you also have the 20% chance of foreign investors who probably believe if I'm holding an RMB, is there a 20% chance in 3 years I'm not getting my money back? And how do you, so I think the RMB is really something that we have to investigate the relationship between that and the dollar. There was this fellow, Charles Kindleberger, who was one of the great currency thinkers of the 20th century. I think, Keynes gets a lot of credit for Bretton Woods. I think Kindleberger was a big part of that, and he called at the time, it was between the U.S. and sterling. He called it the important pair. So I think we've got to rethink the important pair for the U.S. and the CNH. And when you go to reserve currency status, so in the history of the world, there have been 6 reserve currencies. Tell me what all the former reserve currencies have in common. Portugal, Spain, Holland, France, UK. They were also security zones. How did they lose reserve currency status? Especially Spain, they got highly leveraged and could no longer support their military. So, when you tell me that when people in the Biden administration say, well, of course we want to keep reserve currency status, but their 10-year budget projection calls for a 21% cut in defense in a world that seems, if anything, defense spending needs to rise, then you can't keep your reserve currency status if you lose the defense umbrella.
You're an admirer of the late Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Faced with a stagnant economy and persistent deflation, his agenda for economic revival consisted of 3 arrows: aggressive monetary policy, fiscal stimulus, and structural reform. If you were advising, let's say, Donald Trump, were he elected president and he's in office in 2025, what would you suggest as the 3 arrows for a successful presidency?
Well, I might even advise him to campaign on 3 arrows. And it would be 3% real economic growth. And how do you get that? Through the deregulation, more U.S. energy production, slaying inflation, and forward guidance on confidence for people to make investments so that the private sector can take over from this bloated government spending. 2, I would urge him to make public his desire to get the deficit down to 3% by the end of his term. He didn't get us to these 6 or 7% deficits. I think that they averaged 4 under him. So get that down to 3. And then 3 million more oil barrels equivalent a day from U.S. energy production. So that would be my 333. And that would substantially decrease the oil price, which would bring inflation. That's one of the number 1 drivers of inflation expectations. And then back to the Fed, they could go into a proper easing cycle.
Let's talk about deficits and debt. You started off your remarks by just describing how that's been a big motivator for you in getting in the fray and getting into the public policy debate nationally. This year, the federal deficit will land somewhere between 6 and 7% of GDP, and the primary deficit will be close to 4%. That is just staggeringly high relative to Europe, relative to Canada, as you mentioned earlier on. It really is quite an outlier when you're looking at other advanced market democracies. So you're talking about getting the deficit down to 3% overall, not just getting the primary deficit down there. Talk to us about a path that you consider politically realistic and credible. Donald Trump is someone who's very much a pragmatist. He's someone who's not going to want to tank the economy, but I don't think he's going to be close to the idea that some kind of fiscal consolidation might be appropriate. So again, when you're thinking about the path there, what does that look like? Does some kind of fiscal consolidation that is not something that is going to cause an enormous amount of economic pain?
Well, that goes back to my earlier point that I think we are at the kind of the last chance bar and grill for growing our way out of this. And it's got to include, we reinstate the 2017 the Tax Cuts and Job Act with pay-fors. So I think we can tame this, the Green New Deal. We could probably save $1 trillion over 10 years on that. I think there's probably something to do on Medicaid in terms of empowering states, no cuts. I think on discretionary spending, We probably need to do some kind of a freeze except for defense. And I think the market will respond to that. And then I have been very outspoken, and I noticed with great pleasure in the past 48 hours that Senator Kennedy from Louisiana and Senator Hagerty from Tennessee took Secretary Yellen to task for shortening the U.S. debt maturity, which has also eased financial conditions. When people talk about politicizing the Fed, I actually think Treasury has taken over the Fed. As former Fed chair, she knew how to do it. But I think that there is a chance you could get into a good reflexive cycle on debt cost, because I think it's been imprudent to finance at the front end. Like every emerging market blow up I've ever seen always starts the same way. You end up with an asset bubble, sound familiar, that's driven by high deficits, and then the high deficits in an election year get financed at the short end. I call it the three-body problem. And you're not supposed to see this in the U.S. You see it in Turkey, you see it in Argentina, you see it in Venezuela. So this year, interest on the debt is going to be $1.1 trillion.
More than the defense budget.
More than the defense budget. I have an article coming out the next few weeks. I was writing it with Congressman Mike Gallagher, but he has gone to the private sector. He's privatized himself. And I'm a big fan of the congressman. But in it, I say that these high deficits are a national defense problem. Like, these high deficits are going to create a national defense problem. Cicero said, had some quote like, "Unlimited finance is the sinew that drives war, or holds war." Is the U.S. ability to be able to leverage up during a conflict is. The Treasury was able to expand the deficit. Stephen was talking about it earlier in terms of whether it's COVID crisis or war, but U.S. Treasury was able to save the country during the Civil War by expanding the deficit. We're able to save the economic well-being of the country during the Great Depression by spending, and then we're able to save the world during World War II. So we have to get this down, or we have no room for maneuver. Having said all that, so it goes to 1.5 trillion mechanically if there are no interest rate decreases this year. But I think that President Trump, with the right policy, could create a reflexive, self-reinforcing cycle on the downside. And when there is talk, these entitlements are massive. I think that the next 4 years isn't the time to deal with them. That we've got to deal with the discretionary portion of the budget and get that under control. But I think the signal, I always say, crawl, walk, run. We got to crawl, maybe walk our way to get the current deficits under control. Then the next step is for future administration to have the competence to deal with the entitlements.
You spoke earlier on about the historical role of tariffs in protecting nascent American industries, and also this notion of tariffs being used for negotiating leverage. There is, of course, another way that tariffs have been used in American history, and that is as a source of revenue. And I wonder, when the former president talks about the idea of across-the-board tariffs, particularly large tariffs on China, and of course, President Biden has announced his own tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, among other goods. Do you see a role for tariffs as a revenue source? You see some folks saying that essentially this amounts to a kind of consumption tax on American households, but if there's also a geopolitical benefit to it, do you see that as a credible or reasonable strategy to help achieve fiscal consolidation?
Yes. So let's say that there is a 10% tariff. having done currencies for a long time, some portion of that will result in currency appreciation. Normally, it's 2/3 of that. So, now you're collecting 10%. The lift on the currency does 6 or 7% of it for you. So
and hurts exporters.
And hurts exporters. But you're also using it as a geopolitical tool. I was at a recent Council on Foreign Relations meeting, and Jared Bernstein was talking about Biden policy, and to him, anything that they don't like is a market failure. Everything's a market failure. But in the Q&A, a woman from a European think tank said to him, you said the word friendshoring 7 times. You never tell us what it means to be a friend. So I think, like, in terms of tariffs, I think in terms of currencies, I think in terms of bilateral trade agreements, I think in terms of security agreements, I think in terms of values, I think we should make it very clear that there is a green, a yellow, and a red bucket, and we let everyone know where they are in the...
Here's what we ask of you if you want to be counted as...
Here's what we ask of you, and you can choose which bucket you want to be in, and here's what you get for being in the bucket.
I believe we have time for a few questions from the audience.
Hi, Vic Roklitis at MarketWatch. There's definitely a view that in the first Trump presidency, the tax cuts and spending weren't good for our country's financial health. So what makes you think that, he's called himself the king of debt. Why do you think things will go better in a second presidency on that front?
Well, that view would be incorrect. It was fantastic for the country. It is the working wages went up, the capital investment went up, the tax collection level never went down. So then we hit COVID, and I think that we don't know. Things were going very, very well. So I'm not sure. I reject the view that it didn't work for the country. And the debt to GDP, absolute debt to GDP, I think would have been going down from 22 onward. So I think the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act were a home run, across every segment, and it was fueled by private sector expansion. It wasn't fueled by this government spending, and wait for it, non-inflationary, because the demand shock from the private sector was met with the deregulation, as opposed to now the demand shock is being met with supply constriction through regulation.
Any other questions? Oh, I'm sorry, there's someone on this side of the room, and then you'll be next.
Thank you, Charlie Spearing from the Daily Mail. Just in the background, you've been to several of these fundraisers. What is the mood on Wall Street about a possible Trump victory, and are they optimistic or pessimistic? And could you also give me an idea of who they want to see as vice president?
I have no particular expertise. I'll work backwards. I have no particular expertise on the Veep, but I can tell you that I think they'd be happy with the list that leaked out yesterday. I think the Wall Street group would be very, very happy with that. I think the Wall Street group was always going to come back. What I find more interesting is the new venture capital cohort who is supporting President Trump, who, as they say in Las Vegas, the new shooter. This is a completely new group, and it's being socialized now in Silicon Valley. It's okay to be a Republican. It's okay to support Donald Trump. I found Steve Schwartzman comments on why he's coming out in favor of Donald Trump, and a lot of it was anti-Biden sentiment. Whether it's the pervasive anti-Semitism, a lot of these policies. So, there are two candidates now, and there's a clear choice.
I tried to jump the line there, I guess, earlier. Scott, you mentioned that you think policies can get real GDP to about 3%. Potential GDP, according to most people's estimates, has been sub 2, was not much more than 2 in the previous administration. No one really thinks it's changed all that much, maybe a shade here or there. Where do you think this sort of big, going from 1.8 to 3 is a pretty big jump. Where do you see the big differences coming from?
Yeah, look, I think I think the global economy is actually picking up. I think that if you look, so from between Trump and Biden, if you look at the economic data, for Biden, a big jump is in structures, which is the manufacturing. Mining, which is the energy industry, is practically nil. So I think we can do that. I think you can get consumer excuse me. I think you can get consumer sentiment back. I think it can be exports. So I think it could be very broad based, and I think it could be a lot of it driven. I think that just in the energy industry, if they could get some kind of regulatory certainty that that would happen. Some of my clients are some of the biggest private families who are manufacturers in the U.S., and I always ask them, for Trump 1.0, what was more important for you, the tax cuts or the deregulation? The tax cuts were nice, but the regulatory certainty is what enabled us to do the massive CapEx. We would show up at the EPA, at the Obama EPA on a Friday, and we would just ask, seeking some window guidance on our chemical facility. Can we do this? What do you think of that? And they would be on site at the facility on Monday. So I think it can be across the board. And then, look, I think once we can get inflation down, interest rates down, then I think we can have a proper housing boom.
I hope you'll indulge me a bit of a more personal question. So you lived for many years in London, you lived in the northeastern United States, now you're back in your home state of South Carolina. One reaction I've heard from a number of folks on the political right is that in the wake of Donald Trump's experience in his criminal trial, but also in his civil trial, there are a lot of people who've come to believe that if you're someone who holds conservative political convictions, it is no longer very wise for you, if you're someone of means in particular, someone who might be a target, to reside in a deep blue municipality or state. Now, as someone who's a lifelong Brooklyn resident and someone who is, center right in my broad orientation, that's a dismaying thought. But I wonder how you think about that, and when you speak to other like-minded folks who are successful entrepreneurs, investors, people who want to enter into public life, are you getting that sense as well, the sense that people have to migrate to a kind of political safety given the changing climate?
I think the recent verdict is the most, is when the idea of being an enemy of the state, state as in a state government, has maybe come to the forefront. I think in people's mind previously, it was tax rates, regulation, ease of doing business, again, regulatory certainty within state government. So look, this migration from the blue states to the red states is one of the largest migrations, kind of other than the post-Civil War migration by American blacks out of the South. This migration back to red states, but it started before there was this notion of the enemy of the state. But I think there is a risk premium that's being created, but does a risk premium get created on tax uncertainty? I'll tell you, I have one investment in Massachusetts, and Massachusetts put in a tax, an excess tax above a certain level. Massachusetts was my biggest tax bill last year, and I have one investment there. So I think that this idea of economic freedom, I really think it's economic freedom. I don't think we've degenerated yet to this idea of the enemy of the state. I hope we won't. That I'm part of the Republican Party. I've studied game theory a lot. I'm part of the Republican Party that is saying the best revenge is just to win on November 5th. Let's not set off a tit-for-tat chain reaction. Traditionally, conservatives are the adults in the room. Let's stay that way. It's the but it is alarming. It's alarming on both sides to see the breakdown in the federal system. Whether it was during Trump with sanctuary cities, like, we are not going to enforce the law, and the state of Texas feeling as though they have to enforce their own border. Like, I think we got to get back to this idea that the federal system does work.
Everyone, please join me in thanking Scott Bessent.